Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. My name is Aoife O'Leary. I'm the CEO of Opportunity Green, and I will be the moderator for today's session, which is what shipping and fishing must do to avoid a climate disaster. So a little bit heavy, but that's kind of where we are. We are going to have an incredibly distinguished panel who will talk through what both sectors are doing, unfortunately, to cause the climate disaster, but also the solutions. So how we can get away from that. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting. It's a really packed agenda as well. So we're going to be hearing from 5 panelists. I'm going to introduce them as we go along, just to save time more than anything else. We're also going to have a little bit of interaction. So we're going to have some Slido questions to get everyone kind of in the mood. So if you can see the Slido link there. And I think there's going to be a first question, or first poll, I should say, that is going to come up. So if you can get that up whenever it's ready. But we will also, I think, have a link that you can put in your own questions during the whole session as well. And I will remind you about that as we go on. But you can see the first Slido poll there. So it's about climate tipping points. Because our first presentation is going to be from our token man, Professor David A. McKay, very much not a token man. He's incredibly distinguished with the University of Exeter and the Stockholm Resilience Centre. But it's not often I get to moderate a panel where we just have one man, so I felt I needed to say that. Yeah, fishing and shipping, because I know it can be a little bit strange why we're putting the two together, but they are the most harmful activities that are going on in the ocean. We are overfishing and we are overpolluting from ships. I know that we all know very aware of the CO2 pollution, but there's also, we're going to hear about black carbon, there's also methane pollution from shipping, and all of that comes together. But I guess with that, let's hear about the climate tipping points first, which are incredibly important for both sectors. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. McKay.
Cool. Thanks for the introduction. Are my slides up? Cool, great. So yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm here to give you a little bit of background about why the 1.5 degree target is so important. In particular, around this recent paper we published in Science about how exceeding 1.5 degrees global warming could trigger multiple climate tipping points. This research was funded by the European Research Council, funded ERA project, as well as the Earth Commission, and this work was done with colleagues from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, the Earth Commission, and the University of Exeter. So yes, it's very well established now that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are driving global warming. And something that's come out of the IPCC report is that their relationship at a global scale and on the near term is roughly linear. So you can see from this chart from the most recent IPCC report that on the bottom axis there, you have the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions coming into the atmosphere. On the left-hand side, you have the global warming. You can see the black line for historical data is showing that the more CO2 added to the atmosphere, the more warming we're getting, going up to 1.2 degrees there in the middle. On the right-hand side, you have the coloured lines showing future projections, showing that in everything but the lowest emission scenario in light blue there, you're going to be well beyond that 1.5 degrees target that we're talking about a lot at the moment. And we know from the IPCC report that beyond 1.5 degrees, the impact of climate change gets more and more difficult to adapt to. And that's why that's such a key level. But we also know that on a regional scale and in the longer term, climate change's impacts may not always be linear. Beyond 1.5 degrees, some of the climate extremes get much more worse than you would expect from a linear relationship. There's a non-linear increase in extremes. And we also know that passing certain warming levels can lead to tipping points, which cause abrupt or irreversible changes. Next slide. So when we talk about tipping points, in our work, we're talking about when change becomes self-sustaining, when a system is forced beyond some kind of threshold, and that locks in substantial future impacts. So an analogy I tend to use for this is a ball being pushed up onto a seesaw, like in this animation. Imagine you're pushing a ball up that slope towards the pivot. You let go before reaching the pivot, the ball will roll back and return to its original state. But once it gets past the pivot, as it's about to do now, the ball will keep on rolling until it reaches a new state, even if you stop pushing. And that's how a tipping point works. And this sort of behavior is really driven by positive feedback, amplifying feedback that make small changes and amplify them into huge changes over time. And sometimes these manage to counteract the stabilizing feedback that normally characterize systems. Next slide. So it was suggested in the 90s and the early 2000s that maybe the climate system could have this sort of tipping point behavior as well. And the first major assessment of this was this paper by my colleague Tim Lenton in 2008, which assessed where some of the tipping points might be in the climate system and the warming threshold they might curve beyond. This is a map showing some of the ones they proposed and some of the ones proposed since. You can see there's things like ice sheet, permafrost, forests dying back, coral reefs dying off as well, and changes in ocean and atmosphere circulation. Now, since 2008, the estimates for the warming threshold for these tipping points have tended to fall. So back in 2008, it was something like 3 to 5 degrees for most of the candidates, whereas now I think some of these are possible at only 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, that Paris Agreement range. And we're already seeing some signs of destabilization, places like West Antarctica and Greenland, the Amazon rainforest, and possibly the Atlantic circulation as well. So we felt it was timely to do a major reassessment of climate tipping point literature, which is what we did in this paper, where we synthesized over 200 scientific papers published since 2008, trying to identify and categorize different climate tipping points. Next slide. So this is just a summary map showing the ones we identified. We identified 16 climate tipping points, climate tipping elements in the climate system, shown by these different pins. And that's versus 9 in 2008. We focus specifically on the red pins, which are showing the ones that have their central warming threshold estimates below 2 degrees of warming, so in risk in the Paris Agreement range. We have the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets collapsing. We have the convection collapse in the Labrador Sea in the North Atlantic, the widespread abrupt fall of boreal permafrost in northern zones, the abrupt loss of the Barents Sea ice north of Europe, and we have the die-off of low-latitude coral reefs. Of particular interest today, in the ocean-focused section, Greenland and ice sheet and West Antarctic ice sheet collapse would add up to 10 meters of sea level rise over thousands of years. That sounds like maybe not too much of an issue, but that would still amplify sea level rise by 2100, which of course has huge implications for coastal infrastructure in particular. The collapse of convection in the Labrador Sea and the slowdown of wider Atlantic circulation will cause extreme regional weather disruption in the North America and Europe regions, extreme regional cooling, as well as disrupting weather systems in the tropics as well, disrupting the monsoons in the Amazon rainforest and West Africa, for example. Low latitude coral reef style, back to the previous one. Coral reefs, hundreds of millions of people depend on them for their livelihoods, both for fisheries and also coastal protection as well. That would be a major issue. And the Barents Sea ice has major weather implications for Europe as well. Next slide. So this summary plot shows the different estimates for the warming threshold for each of these climate tipping elements. Each bar shows going from the minimum estimate we have up to the maximum estimate based on the literature, with the dotted line and showing our best estimate beyond which we think tipping is likely. And each one shows the different elements we've identified, and those horizontal lines show the current warming at 1.2 degrees, the lower grey line. The Paris range is the green range in the middle, and current policy is that upper grey line. And you can see that our current warming level is already nudging into the bottom end of 5 climate tipping point ranges, making them possible. And by 1.5 degrees, the lower end of that green band, 4 tipping points have passed their central estimate, making them likely, and a total of 6 are possible. And by the time we get to 2.6 degrees, that upper grey line, that current policy is taking us towards, 7 climate tipping points are becoming likely, and 6 of them are possible. Next slide. Yes, just to summarize, we assessed climate tipping point literature over the past 15 years, and we've found that 5 climate tipping points could already be possible, meaning that climate change is already becoming unsafe, and beyond 1.5 degrees, 4 of them become likely. This provides really strong scientific support for why the Paris Agreement aim of 1.5 degrees is so important, and emission cuts in line with 1.5 degrees would help minimize the risk, or minimize the chances of passing some of these climate tipping points. But we can't eliminate them entirely, even at 1.5 degrees. And if we go beyond 1.5 degrees, they only become more likely. That means we also need to think about adaptation in case some of them are passing the need for that thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And while you were talking, we had the poll still going. So interested to see in what our results are if the organisers get them up. But yeah, so there's a clear winner there, as in the loss of Arctic and Antarctic ice seems to be the worst when shipping and fishing are considered, which is interesting because I would have gone for the Atlantic thermal circulation, but I guess that's me. Of course, they're all really bad. But on that note, we are going to move quickly on to Dr. Lucy Gillum from Seas at Risk. And she is going to bring us to looking a little bit, I guess, more holistically at shipping and fishing vessels, and also bringing in a little bit of the EU regulation as well. So to Lucy.
Thank you, Aoife. So Seas at Risk is an association of environmental organisations from across Europe working together to ensure that life in our seas and oceans is abundant, diverse, climate resilient, and not threatened by human activities. Next slide, please. So climate breakdown is happening. We've just seen all about these tipping points, and it's also seriously harming our ocean, making it warmer and more acidic, depleting the water of oxygen. This impacts all marine life. Individuals and industries must act quickly and steeply reduce climate emissions if we're to avoid the worst effects of climate heating. I just want to come back to firstly address the question of why this event combining shipping and fishing. Fishing and shipping together are the most damaging human activities to the ocean, and both industries make use of vessels operating on the high seas. Fishing vessels need to be decarbonised too, and we mustn't forget about them when we're designing climate regulations for shipping. Fishing vessels are generally smaller vessels and can perhaps be decarbonised faster than giant container ships. So smaller vessels should not be excluded from the regulations, and perhaps one of the best places to start. And also, when creating joined-up policy, we also need to think not only about the environmental impact directly of vessels, but also the activities that these vessels perform. In the case of fishing, it's perhaps easy to understand the need for limits on activities, even if today we still currently exceed quotas and fish at unsustainable levels. There is a broad acceptance of the idea that we need to have an industry within limits of the capacities for fish populations to be maintained. We need to apply this idea of limits to shipping also. We need to reduce the environmental impact of vessels and the activities or trades that they are transporting to get within planetary boundaries, solve the climate crisis, and not set off these dangerous cascading tipping points. It's not just how we propel ships through the water, but it's also we need to start thinking about what we ship and if that is sustainable in the long term. Next slide. Now, how big is this problem? The shipping industry is responsible for billions of tons of CO2 equivalent to the emissions of all of Germany, and emissions are growing. Shipping also damages the oceans with noise pollution, oil pollution, air pollution, and harms key carbon engineers in the ocean like whales, fish, and plankton, which Rebecca Hubbard will mention in her presentation. We cannot meet our climate ambition if we leave the shipping and fishing sectors out of climate action. Next slide, please. Now, in 2018, we agreed an initial greenhouse gas strategy for shipping at the International Maritime Organization. However, this strategy, climate action is not sufficient. This strategy is due for revision next year in 2023. Currently, the first phase of measures on short-term action before 2030 are not sufficient to meet the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement aligned limit for climate heating, especially if we continue to allow maritime trade to grow. Now is the time to recognise the risks of climate tipping points and to raise the ambition in those negotiations. Next slide, please. As civil society, we are calling on the International Maritime Organization and all of its member states to take decisive and transformative climate action. What this means is that we need to revise the initial strategy to be clearly in line with the Paris Agreement's limit of keeping heating below 1.5 degrees. This means having a target of halving ship climate impacts by 2030, with full decarbonisation of shipping well before 2050. We need to make deep cuts to black carbon emissions from shipping in or near the Arctic and include black carbon in CO2 equivalent metrics. Dr. Pryor will say more about this shortly. We need to also align the carbon intensity indicator for ships with emission reductions of 7% a year, in line with the Paris Agreement aligned trajectory for emissions reductions. 4, we need to ensure that climate vulnerable nations and indigenous communities are fully involved and enabled to participate in all aspects of shipping industry's just and equitable green transition. And finally, we must take a polycentric governance approach, a networked governance approach to enhance collaboration between all the UN agencies and between other national and international agencies to speed up climate action and make it more effective. Next slide, please. But the IMO isn't the only forum for shipping climate action, and we're here today in the EU Pavilion, so I'm going to talk about EU action. We must also implement an ambitious European Green Deal for shipping. Now, this requires that we include all ships, including those smaller vessels like fishing vessels, with no exemptions. It must cover all climate heating emissions with full life cycle assessment for comparing the solutions and for properly pricing pollution. We need an ocean fund that invests in clean propulsion, wind propulsion, clean ports, as well as the clean fuels that we need to decarbonize. There needs to be an overall cap on emissions, and we need to manage those emissions decline in line with the Paris Agreement goals. The European Green Deal must deliver climate, biodiversity, and zero pollution goals. It must be a package that's designed to maximize co-benefits, and this requires a systems perspective. Next slide. Now, the world's leading climate scientists and economists are warning in great detail by geography and sector that many aspects of maritime trade face not only rising costs, but global systemic disruption from climate heating if we don't rapidly reduce emissions in the short term. Our globalized system of commodity trade creates climate disruption risk across borders. Sea level rise, flooding, permafrost thaw, landslides, extreme weather events will disrupt trade and risk maritime infrastructure, which is particularly vulnerable to climate change, according to recent IPCC reports. Next slide. In the words of IPCC co-chairs, it's now or never. If we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees without immediate and deep emission reductions across all sectors of the economy, it will be impossible. Next slide. Now, this concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lucy, for that. And I think we are going to hear a lot more about some of the specific impacts then of fishing and shipping on the Arctic next. We've got Dr. Sean Pryor from the Clean Arctic Alliance. So I'm just going to hand straight over to you, Sean. Go ahead.
Apologies, just needed to unmute. Thank you. And first of all, can I just say thank you to both Seas at Risk and to the EU for the opportunity for the Clean Arctic Alliance to speak here today. Next slide, please. The Clean Arctic Alliance is a coalition of 20 non-profit groups formed around 7 years ago. Our work is focused through campaigns to change shipping practices impacting the Arctic, and in particular to reduce the risks associated with black carbon emissions and to address the risks of heavy fuel oil spills. Next slide. Thank you. We've already heard a lot about the climate disaster, so I'm not going to go into detail now. But I did just want to remind ourselves of the words of the UN Secretary General from earlier this year. And indeed, He has again made dramatic interventions this week on the opening of COP27. We are on a fast track to climate disaster, and nowhere are these impacts being felt more strongly than in the Arctic. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The Arctic is an important ice habitat for wildlife, unique ecosystem supporting a huge productivity of plant and animal life in the oceans. It is a highway and provides cultural identity for the Inuit people and other indigenous communities. It is also a major climate regulator and is now considered by some scientists to be warming as much as 4 times faster than the planet as a whole. We are experiencing unprecedented seasonal ice loss, permafrost thaw, and increasing ocean temperatures. Next slide, please. Declines in the sea ice extent and volume are leading to a social and environmental crisis in the Arctic, and cascading changes are impacting global climate and ocean circulation. There is high confidence that processes are nearing points beyond which rapid and irreversible changes on the scale of multiple human generations are possible. Next slide, please. There has long been an interest in sailing ships through the Arctic. Some of the early Arctic explorers had as their primary objective to find a route through the ice to the Pacific Ocean or to the Atlantic. And receding sea ice has resulted in renewed interest in Arctic shipping, along with increased risks and threats associated with shipping activity. The Arctic Council reports a 25% increase in shipping in the Arctic and a 75% increase in the total distance sailed by all vessels between 2013 and 2019. Fishing vessels and bulk carriers exporting minerals make up the biggest increases. I'm going to focus in particular on the threat of black carbon emissions, which contribute to the climate crisis, and on action that can be undertaken quickly this decade to reduce the threat. Black carbon is a short-lived climate pollutant produced by the incomplete burning of fossil fuels. It has an impact over 3,000 times that of carbon dioxide on a 20-year global warming potential timeframe. But once it's released into the atmosphere, it deposits out very quickly, and so can be rectified, that the impacts or the threats can be reduced very, very quickly. It makes up around 1/5 of international shipping's CO2 equivalent emissions, and when released near to the Arctic, has a disproportionately high impact because of the warming in the atmosphere and the accelerating melting when it deposits onto snow and ice. And as the snow and ice melt, darker areas of land and water are exposed, which absorb further heat and reduce the reflective capacity of the ice cap. The need to reduce emissions of black carbon because of the climate impacts has long been recognized, and on land, considerable effort has been made to ban dirtier fuels in power stations and to install diesel particulate filters on land-based transport. However, at sea, the shipping industry has moved in the opposite direction, to the use of cheaper, dirtier, residual or heavy fuels that can no longer be used on land because of the pollution that they cause. In recent years, some efforts have been made to try and move shipping away from heavy high sulfur fuels to cleaner diesel fuels. Let me just repeat that, cleaner diesel fuels. These are the fuels that we are trying so hard to reduce use of on land because of the pollution they cause. However, at sea, these are better than the fuels that are currently being used. But unfortunately, the fuel and shipping industries have managed to circumvent international regulation that should have moved ships to these lighter diesel or distillate fuels. And they've done this by blending the heavy fuels with lighter fuels to reduce the sulfur content. But these blended fuels, unfortunately, still have very high black carbon emissions. Next slide, please. Reducing black carbon emissions doesn't require the development of new fuels or new technology. It can be done with immediate effect by switching to diesel fuels. Individual engines would see a reduction of between 42% and 79% depending on the type of the engine and the load of the ship. while moving all of the ships operating in the Arctic and currently using heavy fuels would result in a 44% reduction in black carbon emissions. Installing a diesel particulate filter, again, existing technology that is widely used, but which can only be used with cleaner fuels, will reduce black carbon emissions by over 90%. This really is low-hanging fruit. It is action that could be taken tomorrow by making better fuel choices and by scaling up particulate filter technology and installing filter on all ships. So what needs to happen? Well, globally, we need an International Maritime Organization regulation that would require ships operating in and near to the Arctic to move to fuels which would result in lower black carbon emissions. This is essential, and then no one will be at a competitive disadvantage. The map on this slide shows the black carbon emission reductions that could be achieved by 5 individual ships operating in the Arctic in 2017 if they had used alternative fuels. Another effective measure would be the designation of emission control areas. These are areas of sea where cleaner fuels would have to be used, and these would be particularly effective at reducing black carbon emissions arriving in the Arctic from further south. Next slide, please. Just briefly, I'm going to turn to fishing vessels. I mentioned earlier that the biggest increase in vessels in the Arctic in recent years has been fishing vessels. And while as individual ships, these are not the biggest sources of black carbon because there are a lot of them and they operate for a long time, travel long distances, trawling backwards and forwards, they consume a large volume of fuel and represent 25% of the black carbon emissions from ships in the Arctic. In total, they have emitted 47 tons of black carbon in 1 year. And indeed, one ship alone emitted 0.5 ton of black carbon. So more needs to be done at an international level, but also at a domestic and regional level too. And in fact, there are already some leaders showing the way. Domestic bans on the use of heavy fuels should be introduced by all Arctic nations, and Norway has led the way in this context and has already introduced such a ban in the waters around the island archipelago of Svalbard. Regional regulation is also possible. Lucy's already talked about the EU's Fit for 55 climate package, and there is no reason why this could not include provisions that would require ships operating in and out of Europe ports and traveling to and from the Arctic to have to use cleaner diesel fuels. Of course, reducing ships' black carbon emissions can't be achieved in isolation. It's essential that as discussion takes place and decisions are made, that climate vulnerable nations and indigenous communities are fully involved in these decision-making processes. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm just going to leave you with the Clean Arctic Alliance's call to action. On our website, you can find the Arctic Ocean Action, where bodies with an interest in the Arctic can support the need for better action to reduce shipping impacts on the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you. Very sobering look at what's going on in the Arctic there, but with clear solutions that can be put in tomorrow. And that ties in, just going back to our first Slido question we had, really does show that shipping and fishing are having a huge impact on the Arctic, but at the same time, both those industries are heavily dependent on the Arctic and ensuring that that ice does not melt. So it's very much the two-way street, I think. And we're just on the point of the Slido. We're going to have another poll that we're going to put up, and you guys can put in your answers as we hear from the next speaker. But here is a question around, if there was a carbon price, what would we do with the revenue? And there's also, when you go into the Slido, once you put in your answer to that wonderful poll, there's a Q&A tab as well. So very interested to hear any questions from the audience, and we'll be taking them at the end of the presenters, but feel free to put in questions at any time. So with that, we are going to move from hearing about the Arctic to the Pacific. So our next panelist is Maria Saib from the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport, who will tell us all about what is happening in the Pacific. So, Maria. Maria, I think you are still on mute.
There you go. Can you hear me? All right, thanks, Aoife. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to present on this important issue. Fisheries, as you all know, is part of our diet, protein for our people, and most importantly, our food security. Tuna fisheries in the Pacific is a shared resource as tuna tends to move from one EEZ to another. It is transboundary in nature. Given this challenge, the Pacific decided to cooperate with one another to govern, manage, develop, and protect the shared resource. It belongs to the people, and therefore we are the custodians of this natural resource. For decades, our tuna stocks were exploited by the distant water fishing nations, giving little back to the Pacific Island states. Up until a little over a decade ago, the management regime changed to effort-based management through the Vessel Day Scheme, or the VDS, for skipjack tuna fishery by a group of 8 Pacific Island countries who are known as the parties to the Nauru Agreement, or the PNA, where this resource is available in abundance. This management regime changed the way we talk about fisheries these days. There is a sense of pride, there is a sense of ownership, and then there is a sense of self-determination. VDS has brought in millions of dollars to the region, more than $500 million over the last 7 or 8 years through selling access to the tuna fishing grounds. So you can imagine the level of economic benefit tuna fisheries brings to the people of the Pacific. Tuna fishing in the Pacific is fairly a serious activity with a major transshipment hub out of the Majuro in the Marshall Islands. There are 3 main types of gear, and they are purseine, longline, and pole-in line. Recent stock assessment, sorry, can you go back to the previous? Yeah. Recent stock assessment noted that all tuna species, big eye, yellowfin, skipjack, and South Pacific albacore is either not fish nor is subject to overfishing. This means the tuna stocks in the Pacific is in a healthy state. Fishing vessels catch more skipjack tuna from this region than from the rest of the world combined. In fact, skipjack from the Western and Central Pacific region makes up 35% of the world's total commercial catches of all tunas, not just skipjack. Mostly destined for the canning market, this skipjack stock is a critically important source of food and livelihoods for tens of millions of people around the Pacific and beyond. Next slide, please. The socioeconomic importance of tuna has been recognized by the Pacific Island leaders in their regional roadmap for sustainable Pacific fisheries, which aims to sustain harvests, add value to catches, increase employment associated with tuna fishing and processing, and allocate more tuna for local food security. The roadmap's sustainability goal is being achieved over the past decade. Annual purseine catches from the EEZs of the 10 Pacific states have deviated little from the 10-year average of 1.4 million tons. Cooperative management of the purseine fishery has also enabled tuna-dependent economies to adapt to the profound effects of El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, on the extent of the Western Pacific warm pool and the associated distribution of the abundant skipjack tuna. However, the realization that climate change will alter the tropical Pacific Ocean and cause further modifications to ENSO and the warm pool has prompted the regional organizations assisting Pacific states to manage their tuna resources and to support modeling of the effects of the climate change on tuna biomass. This modeling, which focused mainly on the EEZs of Pacific states, projected progressive redistribution of tuna biomass in equatorial waters to the east and to a more modest extent to higher latitudes. Provided tuna biomass remains high within the EEZs of the PNA participants, the provisions of the VDS are expected to limit the implications of climate-driven tuna redistribution for tuna-dependent economies and the goals of the roadmap. However, many Pacific states are increasingly concerned that redistribution to the east could lead to decreases in tuna biomass within the EEZs and the increase in high seas areas, undermining the socioeconomic benefits they derive from tuna fishing and the strong management of tropical Pacific tuna resources. Next slide, please. So as the greenhouse gas emissions continue to impact our planet, climate change could seriously affect fish populations in the coming decades. Climate-driven variations in sea surface temperatures, ocean currents, oxygen levels, and prey availability influence the distribution of tuna species in the Pacific Ocean. Fishing for tuna is vital to the economies of many Pacific states, but especially for the 10 states that are considered to be tuna dependent. More than 95% of tuna per se fishing in the region occurs within the combined exclusive economic zones, and an average of 37% of their government revenues come from excess fees paid by industrial fishing fleets. Climate-driven shifts in tuna distribution will result in a significant decrease in tuna catch from the EEZs of these Pacific states, severely impacting their economies. Their loss of government revenue due to tuna distribution is serious climate justice issue for Pacific states. We contribute negligible amounts to global emissions, but face a disproportionate financial impact. Under the high emission scenario, by 2050, the percent catch from combined EEZs of Pacific states is estimated to decrease by an average of 20%, which represents 284,000 tons of tuna. In contrast, in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, which you can see on the graph, the green area, the catch is estimated to increase by an average of 27%, or 125,000 tons of tuna. These changes could reduce total earnings from excess fees by an average of $90 million per year for Pacific states, and reduce annual total government revenue for individual states by up to 13%. Under a moderate emissions scenario, by 2050, percent catch is estimated to decrease in EEZs by an average of only 3%, representing 47,000 tons of tuna, an increase by an average of 18%, representing 84,000 tons in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. So the average total loss in excess would be around $12 million, with total government revenue decreasing by an average of 1% in just 3 of the 10 Pacific states. Next slide, please. So as you can see, it is clear from the estimated losses in government revenue stemming from tuna redistribution that action must be taken to sustain tuna-dependent Pacific Island economies and ensure climate justice. The most important pathway, and as many of my previous speakers have highlighted, that the greenhouse gas emissions is to be reduced, and the limit to a rise in global temperature is to be at 1.5 degrees. By achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, the potential impacts of climate change on tuna-dependent economies are expected to be greatly reduced. Now, the current negotiation should also recognize the injustice of climate-driven tuna redistribution and identify a mechanism for granting more responsibility for Pacific states for managing tuna in the high seas of the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. Such outcomes would significantly reduce the impacts of climate-driven redistribution of tuna and allow tuna-dependent Pacific states to maintain economic stability. The last point that I want to emphasize is on cutting greenhouse gas emissions from fishing vessels, as Sian and Lucy had alluded to earlier in the presentation. This could be another prospect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally, although I feel that it is not clear as to which legal instruments would govern the emissions from fishing vessels, but this point needs to be considered for the long-term benefits of fisheries resources and our environment. I thank you for your attention, and Vinakavakalevu and Komoltata for listening.
Thank you, Maria. Really useful and interesting stuff on how the solutions between greenhouse gases and fishing are interlinked. And we are going to stay on fishing, but just in the meantime, if we could see the results of the Slido poll on the use of revenues from carbon pricing. So clear winner there: to mitigate shipping and supply chain emissions in SIDS, LDCs and climate vulnerable countries, which is interesting because yet again, I would have voted for to provide climate finance, climate vulnerable countries. But I guess the two are very interlinked, and it's obviously a bit of a trick question because if we have a carbon price or levy, then probably it will be split between all of the things. But thanks everyone who voted in that. And without any more, because we are a little bit behind schedule, we're going to move over to Rebecca Hubbard from Arfish to stay on the fishing side of things. So Rebecca, I'll let you take it away.
Good morning, and thank you to Seas at Risk for hosting this incredibly important event. I'm sorry I'm a bit croaky. I've been traveling and working. So Arfish, I'm the program director for Arfish, which is a European campaign that focuses on achieving sustainable fisheries to address the biodiversity and climate crisis. As we've already heard, significantly, shipping and fishing actually produce enormous CO2 emissions, particularly for the fishing industry. Actually, it's very little known that just how much emissions that the industry produces. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about how fish and marine life in the ocean is incredibly important to the ocean's capacity to sequester carbon and its capacity to mitigate climate change. But I'm also going to talk about how the fishing industry and the shipping industry can contribute to mitigating climate change directly. So let's start, first of all, with marine life and the fish in the ocean. So fish, like whales and plankton, are carbon engineers. They're a critical foundation of the ocean biological pump. So when people look at the ocean, they see a blue line. But in fact, beneath the ocean, there are billions and billions of marine life that are helping to generate and to move energy throughout the ocean. And they cycle this energy and carbon to the seafloor. This happens on a daily basis. So in this image, you can just see the different factors and the different elements of the biological pump. But without these creatures moving throughout the ocean, really the ocean couldn't sequester around 25% of our carbon dioxide emissions every year. As well, you may have heard, of course, that the ocean is the biggest store of carbon on the planet, and that is within the deep ocean floor. So there are three ways that fishing and to some degree shipping impact on the ocean's capacity to mitigate climate change. The first is through the extraction of fish and marine life. Annually, around the world, 80 million tons or 80 billion kilos of fish are extracted every year. So that removes an enormous amount of carbon and releases it into the atmosphere, and obviously reduces the capacity of the ocean to sequester that carbon. This is estimated to have halved fish's biogeochemical impact on the carbon pump in the last century. So it's a huge impact. We've already heard that fisheries, we have a problem, not just in the EU, but globally with overfishing. And so this is just to emphasize that fish are not just, as we know and as Maria has described, incredibly important for food security and economic stability. They're actually critical to the ocean's capacity to provide important ecosystem services. The second way that fishing really impacts the ocean's capacity to mitigate carbon is through the impact on the seabed directly. So through destructive fishing, like trawling, the huge gear, huge nets drag along the seafloor and resuspend the sediment and also the carbon, preventing that seabed from being able to sequester and store away the carbon for centuries or thousands of years. And the third direct way, which is the most clear with this event today, is through the direct burning of fuel. So the European fishing fleet, for example, is estimated to produce around 7 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year from burning fossil fuel. So that really the three big ways that fisheries and to some degree shipping, because of its impact, as mentioned, on whales and other marine life, impacts the ocean's capacity to mitigate climate change. Next slide, please. So good fisheries management is good carbon management. So through ecosystem-based fisheries management, we can increase the populations of fish as carbon engineers and other marine life populations, because obviously fishing impacts other marine life. And that also increases the resilience of those populations and their ability to adapt to the other impacts that they're experiencing, like warming water and ocean acidification. It protects food webs and the biological pump. It avoids habitat disturbance. It decreases CO2 emissions and it increases CO2 sequestration. Next slide, please. So what fishing and shipping can do to avert climate disaster, there are many things, and a couple of those things can happen very, very quickly. And I will focus mostly on the EU because this is the area that we work and we're in the EU Pavilion. What we need and can do is manage the climate and ecosystem impacts of fishing to protect those food webs and the habitats. So we can set fishing limits which incorporate considerations like predator-prey interactions, like food web functioning and seabed protection or avoiding seabed disturbance. We can decarbonise. Now we know that this is a big challenge for the fishing industry and the shipping industry, but as Lucy said, there are things that we can do immediately which will make a really significant difference. We can reroute and slow down shipping to reduce whale strikes and noise, which both have significant impacts on marine life and fisheries. And we can allocate fishing quota or access to fishing areas to the least damaging fleets. This is very achievable, and the EU can do it using its common fisheries policy and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. We must absolutely stop subsidising fuel tax. This is key. It is currently promoting overfishing and CO2 pollution from the industry. The EU can do this through the review of its Energy Taxation Directive, which it's currently reviewing as part of the Fit for 55 package. And as well, even at a national level, countries can apply proper and appropriate fossil fuel tax. And as well, we'd eventually like to see them become part of the emissions trading scheme as well, because right now, fishing is completely removed from the emissions trading scheme. And finally, since COP is on, we can recognise the fisheries management is carbon management and include it in our nationally determined contributions to our climate action plans, which are officially part of the UNFCCC process. So in closing, I think that there are many things that we can do. And as I think was also stated, we absolutely have to do everything. Every industry must do everything. And at the moment, we have a long way to go, and we're facing some pretty critical scenarios if we don't change. So that's my contribution. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And with that really great call to action, and we've only got one speaker left, so we're almost at the Q&A. And I did want to encourage everyone who is watching to put any questions you have in the Q&A. There's a lot, I have a lot of questions from what we've already heard, but would really love to ask any from the audience. So do please use that Slido link. And on that, we just have one final Slido poll. So if we can put that up now, and everyone can choose their answer while our final speaker is giving her presentation. So the final poll is just going to be on the future of shipping. You mentioned this specifically earlier, but as we move forward and into all of these different solutions we have, are we just going to substitute a different fuel into the current shipping sector? Or are we also going to take a step back and say, well, what is shipping actually contributing? Are we shipping the things that we should be shipping around the world, and do a more systemic questioning? But hopefully that link will go up in a minute. But I'm going to move to Paulus, who's a member of the European Pavillion and utterly instrumental in other please do contribute whatever you think the answer will be. But we're going to hear from Jutta Paulus, as I said. He's a member of the European Parliament, has been utterly instrumental in the European Union's efforts to tackle emissions from shipping, among many other things. But I will hand over to Jutta now.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and sorry I will not put my camera on because the Wi-Fi is not very good. I'm at the COP27 right now, and I think it's a bit overwhelming to have so many people trying to connect to the internet. Yes, thank you very much for hosting this event and for just about shipping and climate and fishing to what we actually still try to achieve, which is keeping within the 1.5 degrees limit to avoid catastrophic climate disaster. I have been fighting for cleaner shipping ever since I joined Parliament 3 years ago, when I was appointed rapporteur for the file monitoring, recording and verification of CO2 emissions from maritime transport.
Okay, I think we may have lost Jutta there, unfortunately. Let's see if she manages to come back and we can hear from her a little bit more later if she does. But in the meantime, why don't we, I guess, go to some questions for our panelists. So we've heard all, I guess, across the globe and across the fishing and shipping industries and all of the different solutions, but all of the problems we have at the moment as well. And I'm just wondering, maybe just to, I guess, take a step back and go back to our first panelist, David, on the tipping points. I was really interested, you spoke a lot about CO2, and I'm a little bit concerned with the answer of this week, but I'm wondering whether shipping's methane and black carbon emissions, are they already factored into those tipping points, or is that something additional? So yeah, interested in that.
Yeah, so all of the tipping point estimates in our study are based on just the average global warming level that each one could be triggered at based on the summary of the literature. So, for example, 1.5 degrees is the threshold for Greenland ice sheet or coral reefs or whatever. That is linked to global emissions of anything causing global warming. But of course, something like Arctic sea ice is particularly vulnerable to black carbon because of its effect on how reflective it is. the black carbon can increase the loss of sea lice, which have a knock-on impact on the green and sheep and boil current loss. So in some particular regions where you can get extra regional climate impacts, things like black carbon would be a really important thing on top of that. But most of our estimates are looking at the kind of the global carbon dioxide and methane emissions and NGO and things like that as well.
Okay. Well, glad to hear that they're already factored in, but obviously those impacts are incredibly important. I don't know if any of our other panelists wanted to comment on any of that. I'll just give you a second in case you want to come in. Okay, well, otherwise, I wanted to, I guess, move on to some of the regulatory, I guess, venues, because we've heard about these solutions, but also, you know, Rebecca made it very, very clear there at the end that we are a long way from implementing all of them. And unfortunately, we didn't get to hear very much from Jutta on where the EU is at. But we also have this global body, the International Maritime Organization. And I'm interested, I guess, from the panel in how you see those two bodies interacting, and are we on the right track? And I guess maybe just to get into the details a little bit more, we've heard a lot about the Arctic, how important that is in terms of both protecting it, but also the impacts from the warming Arctic on both industries as well. And I know there's been increased representation of people from the Arctic themselves into the IMO. And I'm wondering whether that has had any impact on where the IMO is going. But also then in terms of the EU, and we do have, you know, I guess a lot of power in the EU to regulate ships and fishing that are going to and from the Arctic. Is the EU looking at the Arctic as a specific part of regulation, and what is going on there? So maybe to Sean first to answer that.
Thank you, Aoife. There's quite a few questions in there, so I'll start off by trying to address a couple of them, and then I think perhaps Lucy would welcome or be better placed to come in on some of it as well. The IMO is the UN agency that regulates international shipping, so it is vital. It's critical in terms of the solutions. Unfortunately, because it's trying to work on a consensus basis with all of the shipping nations of the world, it takes time. And unfortunately, it doesn't generally have the ability to be very responsive quickly. As a result, for example, on black carbon, we have spent over 12 years now discussing what is black carbon, how do we measure black carbon, and what measures could be introduced to reduce black carbon emissions. We can't wait that long now for action. And so, you know, it's essential, but we've got to find some ways of speeding up. And this is why I think we can't just rely on international regulation. We need to look at what can be done at a domestic level and at a regional level as well. Certainly, having representation at the IMO from Indigenous communities has, I think, helped to focus minds. These are the people that are on the front line of a changing Arctic, not just the front line in terms of the Arctic and their survival of their culture, but also they are likely to be the people who will need to be responding if a ship gets into trouble in the Arctic. So it's essential that these people are there at the IMO as part of that decision-making process. But unfortunately, it's a very slow decision-making process. So we need that, we need action, but we also need to look at what can be done individually by nations and by regional frameworks as well. And Lucy, I'm sure you'd probably like to come in on the EU angles.
Yeah, I'm definitely, thank you, Sean. I think when we're thinking about appropriate actions that we need to take, it's really important that we're taking a networked governance approach. So this means that we're creating the space for Indigenous voices and coastal communities to be able to hear their perspective and to make sure they're taken on board when we're designing these regulations. And we need to make sure that we don't just have a very a narrow carbon or CO2 perspective, because as we've heard, we have to take on board things like, food security, integrity of the ecosystems, and to make sure that we're looking for like the policies that give us like the win-win-wins. And so that's, and that's why we're here today as well. We're here, as part of the UNFCCC process, COP27, to align like the global climate agenda and to have joined up policy making between the different kind of UN forums. So I think that's really important. We need to make sure that we're listening to Arctic, Indigenous communities, Pacific communities, and we really need to make sure that we bring in more of those voices as we go forward to make sure that we design solutions, we decarbonize, and we create a system that enables people to still feed themselves, not to be dependent on complex, highly polluting supply chains, but for those ecosystems near to home to be abundant and to be supporting those communities. So we haven't got much more time to go into the detail, but I think it's to make sure that we're taking this systemic approach and that we're well networked with people around the globe.
Thanks, Lucy and Sean. And yeah, unfortunately, we're basically at time. I did just want to quickly, Maria, if you had any comments on that, because obviously we just focused on the Arctic. Any final comments, I guess, on the Pacific and how those kind of two different but very climate vulnerable and so linked in that way regions are facing what we're looking at in terms of shipping and fishing?
Yeah, thank you. And I guess from the Pacific is just we are the most climate vulnerable, and I think in every forum the Pacific has championed.
Muted, Maria.
I wonder if her.
I'm sorry. I unmuted myself, but I'm sorry. Yeah, so quickly, I just wanted to say that since you have mentioned that we're going into the IMO negotiations right after, not right after, but like after COP27, as you've all probably all aware that the Pacific Island countries have spoken and continues to speak from a high moral ground. We've made multiple submissions and proposals to reduce or cut emissions from shipping sector to zero no later by 2050, and we have a resolution that will go to MEPC 79, which says that we should cut at least 80% by 2040. We've also submitted proposals on levy and a basket of measures at the ISWG GHG 13. And we're proposing to impose a levy of $100 per ton of carbon emissions to generate revenue and help with the transition of decarbonization of the shipping sector. And not just that, but also include equitable transition where no one is left behind. And so this is also generating revenue for cleaner fuels, investing into cleaner fuels, and also outside of the sector where the climate vulnerable can also benefit from the levy imposed and mitigate climate change impacts. So this is one of the many ways in the Pacific that we have voiced concerns and urgency to take action. So I guess we will continue to keep fighting for the 1.5 temperature goal, and because this is about our existence and to sustain our livelihoods. I guess that's all I wanted to say for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. And I think that's a great point to end on. I don't know if we could throw up the Slido results, but otherwise, I mean, really just to keep fighting for that 1.5, both from shipping and fishing playing their parts as they should, is just so vitally important. And hopefully all of you listening will be able to do your part and talk to your representatives, etc., in the EU, IMO, wherever else, and really help them to understand how vitally important that is, as we've heard from all of our panelists today. So we are over time, so apologies for that, but I think it was a really, really interesting session and we learned so much. So thanks so much to Seas at Risk and both the EU Pavilion for hosting this really great panel. And just a pity we didn't get more time for Q&A, and apologies to those who put in questions that I didn't get to. But thank you so much to all of our brilliant panelists and everyone who listened in the audience.